afternoon. My name's Tom, and I'm going to go on to the next slide, I hope. Shout out if you know how to go on to the next slide with this thing I'm doing or not doing. Yeah, start. I work as a Perl developer and consultant. My job does not involve making presentations or delivering them, as you've probably noticed. And on the 20th of August, 2019, I released Perl 5.31.3, which was the first time I'd ever released Perl 5. And so today I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I'm going to start by giving an overview of how Perl 5 releases happen. Then I'm going to talk about how it's developed, how we make sure that Perl's code is good enough quality to release, and then finally, how the release happens. So, first of all, Perl 5 releases. Here's a quick overview of them. You might hear the term Perl 5 core, and this basically describes the central Perl code, the programming language itself, its core documentation, and a small number of CPAN modules that ship with this. And every month, on the 20th of that month, a development release happens. And the idea here is that anyone who wants to see what the next stable version of Perl will be like can download the development release, experiment with it. And a different person will do this. Not totally different people, some people do more than one, but the idea is to get lots of people to understand the process, to take a look at it, and by releasing every month, to ensure that the release process still works. And then every year, there's a stable release. And that's basically the version of Perl that you're encouraged to run your application code against, that people can use. And that year, that stable release is based upon the 12 preceding development releases. Additionally, there are also 0.1 and 0.2 releases that have a small number of critical fixes, security fixes, other essential improvements, but that don't change the code much. And who does all this? Well, there's a group of people, basically the people who carry around Perl are known as the Perl 5 porters. So that's a rough overview of how Perl is developed. Let's go into a bit more of the details. Most of Perl's development takes place through a mailing list. And as I said, the Perl 5 porters are the people who look after this, and the mailing list is unsurprisingly called Perl 5 porters. And with this being an open source project, anyone can subscribe to that mailing list, participate, share their ideas, test out the patches, and whatnot. The code itself goes into a Git repository. And so the development, the stable releases are all made from the Git repository. And like lots of things, this is a centralized Git repository. That's where the people work together. And that's hosted by Booking at the moment. And the development branch within the Git repository is called Bleed. Now, there are lots, you might have seen the term master sometimes, but in Perl it's called Bleed. The idea is it's the leading edge and the bleeding edge. So I think that's a Larry Wall joke. And then there are stable branches as well. So at the moment, the stable version of Perl is 5.30, and there's a branch called maint 5.30. So Perl 5.30.0 is the current stable release, and when Perl 5.30.1 comes out, that will be based off this Git branch. And finally, there are other experimental branches in Git, and these are called Smoke Me, and we'll come to that a bit more later. If people find bugs or have patches for improvements, these go into RT, request tracker, and usually submitted using a command line tool called Perlbug. But this is all changing. Right now, there's a Perl 5 core hackathon in Amsterdam, and they're working on moving a lot of this stuff over to GitHub. The mailing list, I think, will remain, but the idea of Perl 5 developers hosting their own repository will change. But we'll see what happens. Like I say, that's happening now, and what I've described is the way things have happened. We'll see what happens next. So, that's how Perl gets developed. But how do we make sure it's still working? How do we check that this bleed branch and the development releases haven't broken things? Quality is important. Perl 5 has a very, very good test suite. And typically when people find weird bugs, the test suite is extended. So we don't see regressions. So something that was fixed can stay fixed. And of course, as this is an open source project, it's in Git, you can download the code onto your machine and run this test suite. And if it doesn't work for you, you can file a bug report using Perl bug. But that's kind of fiddly because we want to automate this. And for a long time, not only has Perl had a good test suite, but it's had this CPAN module called Test Smoke that lots of people run on lots of different hardware platforms, operating systems, with different compilers and with different configuration options. And what this means is that for every commit that goes on to bleed, these machines known as smokers are checking that the code works in that environment. So if you're using an unusual operating system, or you like to build Perl with unusual configuration options, it's worth looking into setting up one of these smokers. And then you've got a guarantee that Perl, well, not a guarantee that Perl will work on your environment, but a guarantee that you will know when it fails in your environment. Finally, you probably know of CPAN testers who run automated tests against CPAN modules. And bleed break CPAN, sometimes shortened to BBC, is the idea of running these automated CPAN module tests against bleed Perl. And what this means is if someone commits to Perl 5 within a few days or weeks or however long, one of the CPAN testers will spot that a particular CPAN module is broken, and then they will use git bisect. And if you don't know git bisect and you work with Git repositories and you want to find out what broke something, it's wonderful. And so the bleed break CPAN people will mail Perl 5 porters and say, hey, this module doesn't work with the latest version of Perl. And then either the CPAN author or the Perl 5 porters can fix that problem. So far we know how Perl's developed. We know how we make sure that it's mostly good. How does it get released? Well, here's what I did. In the Git repository, there's a directory called porting, and this contains lots of documentation which isn't for end users of Perl, but it's for people who are working on Perl itself. And if you want to make a release, this wonderful document, the Release Manager's Guide, is what you follow. And as I said, lots of people have been working on doing releases, and they work on making this document as good as it can be. And every time you come to a release, if something isn't right, you can improve this document to help the next person who does the release. And that's both true for development and stable releases. There are what are called dual life CPAN modules, and these are CPAN modules that are shipped alongside Perl in its core, but are maintained on CPAN. And one of the release manager's duties is to check that these are up to date and to check that they work by monitoring the smoke reports. And the final duty of a release manager is to write Perl Delta. Obviously, Git, being a version control system, tracks every change to the code base. But looking at all the Git changes would be overwhelming for most end users. So the release manager's job is to pick out the changes that impact end users, to categorize them, and write this Perl Delta document. And what that means is because each development release has a Perl Delta document, when someone comes to release the next stable version of Perl, a year since the previous one, they can look through those 12 Perl Deltas and then summarize them. So it makes writing release notes a lot easier. Basically, you're writing a set of release notes every month, and then every year another set based upon those. And finally, the release manager's job is to watch the smoke reports. There are various web interfaces to the reports that are coming back from the Perl 5 smokers. About a week before I did the release for 31.3, there were loads and loads of failures from the smokers. So I got in touch with people who were either running these smokers or people who had committed code that it looked like was causing problems. We had to back out one of the upgrades to a dual life CPAN module, and that meant because the new version didn't work in some unusual configurations. There was, I think, a problem with floating point, which I will confess I didn't understand because floating point, but someone fixed that as well. And as we got close to the day, I think it was 2 days beforehand, Bleed Perl was working with most of the smokers. Some were still failing, but a lot of those had been failing for a long time because some people run smokers with very, very strict settings, for example, to fail on C compiler warnings. And yeah, in the real world, we're not always as diligent as fixing those at fixing those as we might be, but having the warnings there is helpful. Module core list is a CPAN module that tells us which versions of CPAN modules shipped alongside which version of the core. And it's the release manager's duty to communicate with the maintainer of module core list. All this stuff's mentioned in the release notes, but these for me are kind of the things that I found most interesting or challenging. So yeah, you need to make sure that all the general public using Perl know about the core upgrades. The final, and some might say, most tricky part of releasing Perl 5 is to choose an epigraph. And this is a quote usually from some form of literature or something like that. And of course, there's so much work in the world to choose from. But I chose this quote, which you can't read because the text is too small. I was in the pub chatting to my friend Sam some years ago, talking about dividing God by zero because we're silly people and that's what silly people talk about. And my friend Sam is a novelist, so I was reading through one of her new books a few years ago and found this quotation. I thought, wait a minute, I know where she's got this from. So I thought, if my friends are going to put my pub conversations in their novels, I'm going to put their novels in Perl 5. So that's where we're at. So we've basically, at this point, it's just a case of building the tarballs, uploading them to Pause. Pause is the server where CPAN modules are stored. And then these new development releases get distributed around the world. And basically, the good thing here is that I'm just building these tarballs when I do the release. All the work, the kind of the scary stuff is not really the release itself because you've done so much work beforehand. So making the release is just build tarballs, upload them to Pause, and you're there. So on the day of the release, that's what I did. The release was done from my home, because hey, why not? And I live in just about the middle of this photo. Some people have told me I live in Windows XP, but it's not true. Another literary thing, if any of you read George Eliot, one of the characters in Adam Bede lived around the corner from here, apparently. So, after I've done the release, the next thing I'm supposed to do is improve the process. I've not been as good at that as I had planned because I've got some notes, but most of those notes have gone into making this talk. So I promise you that after this conference, I will actually go and improve the release process and commit a few things. Definitely do that. And yeah, the key thing about all this is that it shouldn't be magic or special. There are so many different parts of Perl 5 development that doing a release isn't a big scary thing. It's not an unusual thing. And mostly it just works. And so even if you're not interested in Perl 5's release, you probably have software that you release. And I hope that the story I've told today is helpful as a way of looking at how you do that. The idea that we have these development releases that people can run themselves, anyone can download and experiment with. The idea that we have automation checking this as well. And the idea that lots of people are doing this. So that when you come to doing a release, it's not magic. That's the key thing. Basically, you don't want it to be scary. You don't want to kind of end up pulling a rabbit out of a hat or anything like that. You just want your releases to work. And so that's my story of how I released Perl 5.31.3. Thank you. I think we've got time for questions if we have any.
Who are the release managers and how did you end up becoming one?
Ooh, that's a good question. So yeah, who are the release managers? Well, like I say, there's the Perl 5 Porters mailing list is where all this happens. Sawyer is the person who's known as the Pump King. And again, this is another one of, I don't know if that one's Larry's joke, but anyway, it's a silly pun. And the Pump King is responsible for choosing release managers. And in this case, Sawyer wrote to the mailing list, the Perl 5 Porters mailing list, saying, hey, we need release managers. A few people over the years have said to me, you should do a release sometime. Why don't you do one? And so I thought, well, okay, this time I'll reply saying, yeah, I'll do a release. So basically, the Perl 5 Porters mailing list coordinates this. Any more questions? Well, so the question is, will I do it again? I think it's, what I really like is the idea that lots of people are doing this. So yeah, maybe, I think it would be interesting to try it a second time around to see what's different about doing it with previous experience versus never having done it. So yes, I think it would be interesting to try a second one. But really, I think the great thing here is to get as many eyeballs on the release process as possible, so that it's all about sharing the load. So yes, I wouldn't be averse to doing it again, but I think it would be lovely to see even more people volunteering for that. Any more questions?
How do security flaws and things like that fit into this?
Ooh, what a wonderful question. Yeah, how do people deal with security flaws? So I didn't cover that because there's a Perl 5 security mailing list. I don't know who's on that. I would imagine Sawyer is as the Pump King, and a very, very small number of key Perl 5 core developers are on a security mailing list. So if you find a security risk in Perl, you obviously don't want to share it with the public. So people mail that security list, and then the people who are involved in that will commit to bleed Perl or one of the maint branches or something like this. So yeah, the security stuff doesn't happen in public, but enough of the people who understand the repository are involved in that. Okay, well, we started late, but we seem to have caught up the time. Thank you very much. Enjoy your lunch.